of U.S. Incarcerated Adults, a PIAAC study, which is part of CALPRO's Adult Education Research Webinar Series that comes out of its Research-Based Practices Initiative. For those of you who are familiar with the series, you might already know this, but for those of you who aren't, the goal of this series is to engage practitioners and researchers on topics relevant to adult educators in California. And I think that you'll find today's webinar is really in line with that, and I think it'll be a very interesting webinar. With us today, we have Emily Pawlowski and Derek Holliday, who both work on the Program for International Assessment of Adult Competencies, or PIAAC, team at the American Institutes for Research. And they do that in support of the National Center for Education Statistics. They work on tasks including quantitative analysis and dissemination efforts, such as our webinar today. And I'm really excited to hear what they have to share with us. So with that, I will now turn it over to you, Emily and Derek. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us. We are very excited to be here to present these findings. Welcome everyone to our presentation on the latest results of the study on the literacy and numeracy skills of U.S. incarcerated adults, a PIAAC study. As Marcella said, I am Derek Holliday, and with me is Emily Pawlowski, and we are going to look at a few of these results. So the way that this presentation is going to be outlined, we're going to first start with a brief introduction on what is PIAAC and the U.S. prison study. Then we are going to work our way towards exploring issues within the prison population. And we're finally going to end with resources that you all may be able to use to for your own research or your own practices. So the questions that we're going to be covering today are covered in these three. The first of which is, who are the U.S. incarcerated adults and what are their backgrounds? Those of you who are already involved in incarceration or in prison studies may know a lot about this already, but we're going to cover that briefly. To what extent are incarcerated adults participating in education and skills training? And then to what extent are incarcerated adults using literacy and numeracy skills in their prison jobs? So for the first question, what is PIAAC and the U.S. prison study? So PIAAC is an international large-scale assessment that was first administered in 2011 and 2012 in 24 countries, and that included the U.S., and those results from that initial round of assessment were released in 2013. It is organized by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD, and is assessed to 16 to 65-year-olds non-institutionalized, residing in each country, but that is irrespective of their nationality, citizenship, or language status. So as long as they reside in the country, they are eligible to be sampled. It is administered to a sample of about 5,000 U.S. adults, either on laptop computers or paper or pencil if those adults are unwilling or unable to take the assessment on a laptop computer. And then in 2013 and 2014, the U.S. supplemented its original sample with an additional 3,660 more adults in order to focus on the following populations: the unemployed, age 16 to 65, young adults, age 16 to 34, and older adults, age 66 to 74. And again, this is only the United States supplement. And additionally, and this is why we are all here, is there was a supplement that was conducted on a representative prison sample of 1,300 inmates ages 18 to 74 in state, federal, and private prisons. And do note that this does not include jails, since jails tend to be shorter-term incarceration periods. So PIAAC administers a background questionnaire and a direct assessment of literacy, numeracy, and problem solving in technology-rich environments. So we have both cognitive and non-cognitive assessment items. So you have the background questionnaire, which asks respondents demographic, education, and employment information. And then you have the actual assessment portion, which looks at the key information processing skills. So the background questionnaire sort of gives context to the responses on the direct assessment portion of the assessment. So the PIAAC background questionnaire collects data on use of the following skills. The first being cognitive skills, and this involves your reading, writing, mathematics, and use of information and communication technologies, and work or at home. Learning skills, so coaching, formal, informal learning, and updating professional skills. Interaction and social skills, so this is the collaboration and cooperation, work and time planning, communication and negotiation, and customer contact. Physical, and also we have physical skills, so use of gross and fine motor skills, education, training, and work, so past and present education and work experience. And then in addition, the US had some specific additions that it added to its own background questionnaire, and these involved basic skills training, political efficacy, health, race, language, adaptations to formal education, informal training, occupation, and earnings. And these were US-specific additions. As for the direct assessment portion of PIAAC, there are 3 subjects that PIAAC measures. So the first is literacy, which is understood as understanding, evaluating, using, and engaging with written texts to participate in society, to achieve one's goals, and to develop one's knowledge and potential. Numeracy is the ability to access, use, interpret, and communicate mathematical information and ideas in order to engage in and manage the mathematical demands of a range of situations in adult life. And then problem solving in technology-rich environments, also referred to as digital literacy and often abbreviated to PSTRE throughout this presentation, involves using digital technology, communication tools, and networks to acquire and evaluate information, communicate with others, and perform practical tasks. So PIAAC results are reported in 2 ways. The first and easiest way is as average scores on a 0 to 500 scale, but that is given context by the second way in which it is reported, and that is as proficiency levels, which are anchored by a specific set of concrete skills. So there are 6 levels for literacy and numeracy and 4 levels for digital problem solving. That gives context to the average scale scores, and we'll look closer at that right now. So for literacy, this is how PIAAC defines each proficiency level by the skills needed to perform at each level. So these range all the way from below level 1 to level 5. And at below level 1, we just have very basic locating a single piece of information in familiar text. And as you go up the ladder here, you end up having more inferences, more places that you need to get this information from, all the way up to level 5, where you're able to integrate information across multiple dense texts, construct syntheses, ideas, or points of view, or evaluate evidence based on arguments. So these are pretty complex tasks, whereas at the lower levels, you're not doing too many things at once. For numeracy, the scale looks like this, where at below level 1, you have things like basic counting, arithmetic operations with whole numbers, and then you start adding more operations as you go up the scale. So you have percents at level 1, spatial representation and estimation comes at level 2, as well as understanding certain tables. Then you get into a more advanced mathematical operations or concepts such as statistics, relationships between statistics, all the way up to level 5, where we're looking at complex abstract mathematical and statistical ideas, and also looking at mathematical ideas that are embedded in complex texts. Just to give a better understanding of sort of what these skills look like in the assessment, here's a numeracy example item at level 2. Note that this isn't actually a test item, but it is a very close replica of one that you would find on the test. So here we see a problem in which the test taker is presented with factory data for 2 years and a bar graph. So on the left-hand side, you see the table there, and on the right-hand side, you see the graph. And the test taker is asked to find 2 mistakes in the bar graph as it relates to the table. So to solve this question, the test taker needs to compare the table to the bars in the chart and find 2 bars that do not match the data in the table. So this is still a relatively simple task, but this is level 2. And as you can see here, the data for June and July in the bar graph are switched from what it should be in the table. Now, we're going to start getting into sort of results here. As you can see, that 48% of the prison population were likely to get this answer correct for this sort of test item, whereas 71% of the household population are able to get this answer correct, are likely able to get this answer correct. So we already see this divergence between the prison and household populations, which we're going to explore further in the future slides. Getting more specific to what the U.S. prison study is, it was an administration of PIAAC to a nationally representative sample of incarcerated adults, and the background questionnaire, referred to as the BQ here, was mostly the same as the household assessment, with some changes asking about prison-specific programs and activities, since living situations differ so drastically in prison compared to household. It was administered in 2014 to about 1,300 adults ages 18 to 74 in 98 state and federal prisons. And this follows in a tradition of U.S. prison studies, with previous studies including the National Adult Literacy Survey, or NALS, which was conducted in 1992, and the National Assessment of Adult Literacy, or NAL, which was conducted in 2003. Now we're going to get into who are the U.S. incarcerated adults and what are their backgrounds. An estimated 1.6 million adults are incarcerated in U.S. prisons in 2013, and the U.S. is the highest prison population rate in the world. Compared to the U.S. household population, and many of you who work in corrections will know this, majority of U.S. prison population is male, about 93%, and younger, greater than 70% are under the age of 45. And then Black and Hispanic adults are disproportionately overrepresented in the U.S. prison population as it compares to the household population. Additionally, 94% of U.S. incarcerated adults have a high school education or below, so they tend to be at a lower level of education than the household population. Additionally, 73% of surveyed adults had been previously incarcerated, so there's a relatively high recidivism rate. Nearly half were employed full-time prior to incarceration, and then sources of income varied but were mostly from paid jobs. In 2014 dollars, incarcerated people had a median annual income of just under $20,000 prior to their incarceration, which is 41% less than non-incarcerated people of similar ages. And then we can visualize that divergence in annual incomes with this graphic provided by the Prison Policy Initiative. On the left-hand side, we see the income levels of incarcerated people broken up into certain categories, so less than $22,000, and then from $22,000 to $37,000, and then $37,000 plus. And on the right-hand side, we see non-incarcerated people. And basically, you find that the distribution is almost mirrored between the two populations. So 57% of incarcerated people had an income less than $22,500, whereas 57% of non-incarcerated people had incomes that were greater than $37,500. Now, getting into the findings of the prison assessment, incarcerated adults have significantly lower skills than their peers in the household populations. So in the solid color, you see the U.S. prison population scores, and in the stripes bar, you see the U.S. household population. So on the left, you see in literacy that the U.S. prison population scores significantly below the U.S. household population, with the U.S. household population averaging just under a level 3 level of performance, and the U.S. prison population averaging just at level 2. And as you remember from our example item from before, this isn't a very high level of literacy skill. And the same sort of relationship was found with the numeracy domain as well, with the U.S. household population outperforming significantly the U.S. prison population, and the U.S. prison population not even reaching level 2 levels of proficiency. Additionally, if we look at the population by race, we see that a large proportion of across all races, a very large proportion, a large majority have only a high school degree or below a high school degree, upwards of 80 to 90% in total for all races. And at the bottom here, you also see the percentages within percentages of the prison population within each racial category. So the black population is disproportionately represented in this prison population, with white population being 34%, Hispanic at 22%, and other at 7%. So we can see that population percentage here. Now, if we compare this with the household population, you see that while a large number still have only a high school or below high school degree, a much larger number have above an associate's degree. And the racial population statistics change quite drastically, with the white population being 66%, black population being 12%, Hispanic 14%, and other being 7%, which is the same. So there's quite a divergence in the racial makeup of the prison population as well as the educational makeup. Additionally, average literacy scores of incarcerated Black and Hispanic adults were not significantly different from their peers in the household population. So if we look at the Black and Hispanic scores here, even though the percentages are quite different, the actual average scores for literacy were not significantly different from each other. However, with the white population and the other population, the U.S. prison population scores significantly less than the U.S. household population. And again, you can see the proficiency levels here, with only the white household population breaking the level 3 level of proficiency on average, whereas every other group falls within that level 2 range. However, if we look at the numeracy scores of incarcerated adults, we see that across all races, the U.S. prison population on average scored significantly less than the U.S. household population. So that's regardless of racial category. We see that the prison population was scoring much lower. Seeing it by proficiency level here, there tended to be a lower level of proficiency. So both the Black and Hispanic prison and household populations were scoring at level 1, whereas the white U.S. prison and household populations were scoring at level 2. And with that, we have a quick question, which is going to be, what do you think of these results, reflecting on all this? And did anything surprise you? So an option to answer that should be provided here.
And we'll have anybody enter the answer to your question, your thoughts, in the chat pod below, and we'll be able to read them out. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I guess while you are all thinking about that, I will hand it over to Emily, who is going to present the next portion of this presentation.
Thank you, Derek. Yeah, I'll just wait another second to let people type their answers before moving on to start discussing to what extent are incarcerated adults participating in education and skills training. Yeah, just there's a huge disparity in the math levels. It's very startling. So Tracy wrote that the results were not surprising, but seeing the starkness of the statistics is disturbing. How can we assist with reentry if individuals are not provided access to educational services while incarcerated?
And that's a great question that we will also have some findings for related to access to educational services while incarcerated later in this presentation.
Yep. Many do not want to participate in literacy classes unless mandated by the courts. So we'll discuss that a little bit later on, what inmates' interest in literacy classes is. All right, just one more minute, then I'll move forward. All right, so I'll move on to the next section now to discuss education and skills training. So the PIAAC Prison Background Questionnaire asks several questions about the inmate's participation in academic programs. So some sample questions include: during your current period of incarceration, what is the highest level of education you completed? Are you currently studying for any kind of formal degree or certificate? Are you on a waiting list to enroll in an academic class or program of study? What are the reasons you would like to enroll in an academic class or program of study? And during your current period of incarceration, did you take any classes or have a tutor to prepare to take the GED or some other high school equivalency program or adult high school program? So, as you guys, I know some of you guys were discussing in the chat box what the interest in education is among incarcerated adults. So actually, based on the PF background questionnaire, we saw that there was a lot of interest in education among these incarcerated adults. So 42% of our sample completed some level of education during their current prison term, and 21% are studying for a formal degree or credential, and 79% are currently not studying, but of those, a large percentage want to study for a formal degree or credential. So over 2/3, 70%, actually do want to study for a formal degree or credential out of those who are not currently studying. So this kind of does show that there is a lot of interest among these incarcerated adults, and they do want to continue their education. So almost 1/3 of incarcerated adults wanted to enroll in a college or trade school level of education. So this figure shows the percentage distribution among those who indicated that they wanted to enroll in an academic class. 29% wanted to attain a certificate from college or trade school. The other most common ones were 18% wanted a high school diploma or GED, and 18% wanted to attain an associate's degree. So the majority of incarcerated, so what reasons do you guys see as the most common reason that inmates may want to participate in academic programs? So some different reasons that we asked about were increasing knowledge or skills in the subject that interests them, increasing possibilities of job assignment, obtaining a certificate, and family-related reasons, or that they were required to participate. So it looks like we got a mix of responses from you guys in between wanting to increase knowledge or skills in subject that interests them, increase possibilities of job assignment, and required to participate. I guess most common response that you guys thought would be the most common reason for inmates is increasing possibilities of getting job assignment. So yeah, that is one of that is actually the third most common one that we saw there. So the most inmates wanted to enroll in an academic program to increase their knowledge and to increase their chances of getting a job. So 41% wanted to do it out of interest in subject that interests them, while 39% wanted to increase possibilities of getting a job when released. And then, so looking about those who didn't want to enroll in classes, what were their reasons? Almost a quarter of incarcerated adults indicated that the classes were not useful or that they did not have the qualifications to enroll. So, so 13% said the programs weren't useful, 10% said they did not have the qualifications that were necessary to enroll. And then, as you see, the other response has 51%. So those included responses such as they wanted to devote their time to working on their legal appeals, their imminent release from prison, or they're already enrolled in some other type of class or training, or they just weren't interested. So next I'm going to discuss some participation in skills training. So some example questions from the background questionnaire that asked about participation in job training included, during your current period of incarceration, have you participated in a job skills or job training program? For example, a computer skills program that teaches Microsoft Word. Are you on a waiting list for any job skills or job training course or program? And what are your main reasons for wanting to participate in this program or for not attending? So when we look at participation in job training programs among incarcerated adults, 23% participated in a job training program during the current prison term. So that means 77% had not participated in a program. But of those 77%, 14% were on a waiting list. So when you look at the reasons why incarcerated adults were interested in participating in job skills training, the most common options were self-improvement. So 63% of inmates selected that as the main reason. And also 43% selected to increase possibilities of getting a job when released. So they could actually select multiple reasons. That's why this adds to greater than 100%. But you see here, yeah, the most common reasons were self-improvement and getting a job post-release. So we were, the question we had for you guys here was, what do these results say about the position of formerly incarcerated adults after their release, and what do these results mean for your work? So while you guys are typing your responses, I'll start discussing the next section, which will cover the question of to what extent are incarcerated adults using literacy and numeracy skills in their prison jobs. So Tracy said that it seems that there are not adequate training opportunities, or the training is in areas that may not result in a job after release. If there's no access or low interest due to the type of program, individuals are not able to prepare in advance of their release. Yes, that is a very good point. Yeah, I think towards the end we'll discuss some policy options that may help to deal with these issues. So some of the questions that the PIAAC background questionnaire asks about access to jobs and skill use in prison include, if during your current incarceration, do you currently have any prison job? Are you on a waiting list to start a prison job? And in your current prison job, how often do you normally read? So read different items such as directions, instructions, manuals. How often do they write? So things like letters and filling out forms. And how often they calculate things such as prices, costs. And they're also asked if they use a computer in their current job. So the majority of incarcerated adults had prison jobs. So 61% had a prison job, but many of these incarcerated adults that had prison jobs, they were not really given an opportunity to use literacy and numeracy skills in those jobs. So in addition to the 61% that had a prison job, 29% were on a waiting list for a prison job. And compared to those with a prison job, those without a job have lower literacy scores but have similar numeracy scores. So yeah, again, Susan mentioned about how the training is not may not help to get a job that pays living wage, and interest-driven options may not help them to get jobs, and how if the training is offered is attractive or approachable, and if there are prerequisite skill preparations available prior to training opportunities. And Usha asked that perhaps there's difference in results between prisons and county jails. Yeah, that would be interesting to look at. Like as Derek mentioned, the PIAAC study only looked at prisons and did not look at county jails, but that would definitely be an interesting question. So as I just showed you that those with the prison jobs had higher literacy scores but equivalent numeracy scores to those without. When you see what types of skills the inmates are using in their prison jobs, both types of skills were not used often in their jobs, both literacy and numeracy. So you see only about half of inmates ever read directions or instructions or letters or memos in their jobs, and even higher percentages. And then 81% and 65% of inmates never read books or never read manuals or reference materials. So this shows not a very high rate of use of literacy skills. But then when you look at the numeracy skills, the percentages of never using them in their prison jobs are even higher, all in the over 80% of never using for calculating prices, costs, or budgets, using or calculating fractions, decimals, or percentages, and using calculators. And only 10% of incarcerated adults use computers in their prison job, which is not that surprising based on the types of jobs that inmates may typically get, such as doing things like cooking, cleaning, or clerical work, or laundry. But when you look at those who do use a computer in their current prison job, they scored higher in literacy than their peers who did not use one. But when you look at the numeracy scale, the scores are not significantly different. So after looking at these results, what do you guys think about the value of incarcerated adults having prison jobs, and why or why not do you think there's value to these prison jobs? So Susan wrote that there is value and an overlooked opportunity to use prison jobs as practical training for the gaps that exist in literacy and numeracy. Yes, that's a very good point. Yeah, I know it's pretty concerning to see when you look at the skill use in the prison jobs and they're really not given much opportunity to utilize and develop their skills in the jobs that most inmates have. And Tracy wrote that work can contribute to positive feelings of self-worth, but if the jobs available don't increase skills, they're not preparing for work post-release. So looking at computer use a little more, so both individuals in the prisons and in the households for the PIAAC sample were asked whether they ever use a computer. So in both, most individuals indicated that they had. So 85% of households and 87% of prison participants. But among those who had used a computer, there was no significant difference in their literacy skills between the prison and household. But inmates who had never used a computer scored higher in literacy than their household counterparts who had never used a computer. But when you look at the numeracy scale, the pattern was reversed. Among those with computer experience, the household population scored higher in numeracy than the prison population, but those without computer experience, there was no significant difference between the household and prison populations. So now looking at what some of the benefits of correctional education are, looking at some of the previous research on this issue, incarceration impacts unemployment and earnings in a number of ways. So this can include higher unemployment rates for ex-offenders and lower hourly wages when they are employed. And so the benefit of correctional education is that the chances of obtaining post-release employment are 13% higher among inmates who had participated in educational programs while they were incarcerated compared to inmates who did not participate. In addition, inmates who had participated in correctional education programs, they had a 43% lower odds of recidivating than inmates who did not. So this can really help to reduce the prison population. And so when you see that the reincarceration costs are $870,000 to $970,000 less for those who receive correctional education, you can really see that the cost of correctional education really ends up paying off and saving a lot of money through reducing recidivism. So looking at the role that states can play in ensuring that inmates can get correctional education. For example, in Minnesota, the Minnesota Department of Corrections mandates educational program for all inmates without a high school diploma or equivalent. And the inmates must have a high school diploma or equivalent course to get a job within the Minnesota Department of Corrections facilities. So some research on this, Stewart et al. Found lower rates of recidivism 3 years after participation in education programs. And re-arrest and reconviction were also significantly lower. And reported wages were higher for education participants than non-participants. So again, we're seeing a lot of the benefits that I just described here. Less recidivism, higher wages among those who participate in education. Another study by Ju et al. Found that a third of inmates released in 2007 to 2008 received a secondary degree while in prison, and they increased their chances of finding employment within 2 years of release by 59%. So looking at another example of a successful program, this program is called Hudson Link for Higher Education in Prison. So this program provides college education, life skills, and reentry support to incarcerated and formerly incarcerated adults. This includes a college preparatory course. So this is designed to prepare students for college level study. If they don't have the skills necessary yet for college level studies, this course will get them up to speed. And then once they are ready, they have college level courses. So this is within the prison facility, and it's a collaboration with several accredited institutions of higher learning. And then once inmates are released, there is college completion support. So if a student's released, they have the opportunity to complete their degrees at various on-campus locations if they hadn't been able to complete their college courses while they were incarcerated. In addition, they also provide other alumni services, such as partnerships with reentry organizations, and the alumni office providing job readiness skills. So this includes things like job search assistance, resume reviews, professional mentoring, interview attire, everything that these inmates, released inmates need to get jobs and re-enter after their release. They help to provide the support for that. So to look at the outcome of the Hudson Link for Higher Education in Prison programs, so it costs $60,000 for New York State to incarcerate one person per year, compared to it costs $5,000 for Hudson Link to educate one person per year. And then when you see the benefits of incarceration versus education, you see that New York State generally has a 42% recidivism rate. Well, when you look at the recidivism rate among Hudson Link, only 4% is the recidivism rate. So you see that's a big difference, saving a lot of the education costs are really paying off by reducing reincarceration costs. So that's just one type of example of education programs that help to connect correctional education and training to reentry. So some types of these formats include career pathways. So this is a comprehensive approach linking education, training, and support services, and really kind of looking at the job market, trying to train people for the job that will be available when they're released. Again, there's another type that helps to connect education and training to reentry is the Integrated Education and Training, or IAT, which brings together adult education, workforce preparation, and workforce training simultaneously and strategically to meet a single set of learning outcomes. So these really try to kind of do a combination of fundamental literacy skills but also job readiness skills to prepare people for jobs once they're released. In addition, other programs like you just saw, there's partnerships between prisons and post-secondary institutions or education service providers, and this really helps for continuity. So like when they're working in courses while incarcerated, they have more opportunities to gain credits, and then that will transfer once they're out, or to be able to continue their course once they're released. And also just in general, it's very important to ensure comprehensive support upon reentry. So things like even just making sure they have the support they need to get housing or apply for jobs, things like that. Once these incarcerated adults are released. So Susan, so the question we asked here was, have you seen any programs in your state using any of these models? If so, are they effective? So Susan wrote that we offer CTE and GED programs in our county jails. Next year, they're including wraparound services that include soft skills before reentry, in transition to additional learning opportunities, and that's in San Diego County. Yeah, and Lynn wrote in the other chat box that asking why more jails and prisons are not emulating successful systems in Minnesota and Missouri. I think that's a really good question. I think something that's really important policy idea is just kind of really scaling up the programs that are shown to be successful as much as possible and learning from the successful programs. Just to overview some different policy ideas that we've seen for organizations such as the CLASA Center for Law and Social Policy. So some policies on the federal level can include reinstating Pell Grant eligibility for incarcerated people, because this really would allow them to fund their education while they're incarcerated. Reauthorizing the Second Chance Act, so that provides grants to help prisoners as former prisoners as they're reentering society. Other policy ideas include fully funding Title I of WIOA and encouraging states and local areas to target funds to individuals facing significant barriers to employment. So this would include justice-involved youth and adults. So at the state level, like I mentioned, it's important to support correctional education and investing in and scaling up best practices, learning from the programs that are getting good results. And as some of the example programs I showed you, it's really important to collaborate across education, workforce, and criminal justice silos. So you can provide continuity and you can ensure effective access, delivery of education and training before, or during and after incarceration. In addition, it's important to provide equitable and accessible financial aid. So this goes along with the next point of reducing collateral consequences that criminal conviction can have on employment and other opportunities. So even things like housing, financial aid, making sure that we're not unnecessarily penalizing formerly incarcerated adults, and that in ways that would prevent them from becoming employed and effectively continuing their education. So this is a quote from a formerly incarcerated adult in a state correctional system. Her name is Erin Olimar. She, at an event we had towards the end of last year, she was talking about her experience while incarcerated, and she said, at one point, George W. Bush said, "America is the land of second chances, and when the gates to the prison open, the path ahead should lead to a better life." And I think that quote encompasses the exact feeling that we all had and why we were taking a lot of these classes. The majority of women I came into contact with that enrolled or planned to enroll in courses, whether they were academic or vocational, did so in the hopes of not only expanding their knowledge, but helping increase the likelihood of finding gainful employment upon release. So the question we had here was, we were wondering if do you see similar attitudes among incarcerated or formerly incarcerated students? But I guess while you guys are responding to that, I will hand it over to Derek to discuss some of our resources that we have.
Thank you, Emily. So I think the latter half of Emily's presentation sort of underlies the fact of how much policy debate goes in around the incarcerated population. And what PIAAC really offers is a lot of data that allows that debate to happen in a well-informed space. So we have put together a number of resources that would allow all of you in your line of work to understand the data and to apply it to your own sort of areas. And we have a comment in the chat box about more students seem to feel hopeless than hopeful within the incarcerated population as a response to the quote. So definitely something to keep in mind is sort of how these opportunities can increase that level of hope for the incarcerated population, and sort of how PIAAC could give context to that. So the first real place where you would find this resource would be the US PIAAC Prison Report, which is the full report for all the findings related to the US PIAAC Survey of Incarcerated Adults. And you can find that on www.piaacgateway.com. Additionally, Emily mentioned the release event at which Aaron spoke and gave that quote. We have a number of video recordings of that prison release event that are on the Gateway. There was a great presentation by Dr. Stephen Profaznik of the National Center for Education Statistics that gave insights into the findings of this report. Erin also spoke on her experiences with correctional education and job opportunities, and we had a number of people speak on panels related to the findings of this report. So you can find all of that on the Gateway, and it's a really great resource to start your journey into PIAAC prison data. Additionally, since I know that many people are involved in correctional education here, there are a number of research to practice guides that are available on the PIAAC Gateway, and these are developed using PIAAC's conceptual frameworks in literacy, numeracy, and problem-solving in technology-rich environments. And these are meant to enhance instruction using elements of the literacy, numeracy, and digital literacy framework, conceptual frameworks. And again, those are available on the PIAAC Gateway. Additionally, there are a few other resources on the Gateway, one of which is the Researcher's Corner. So for those of you who are researchers or are generally interested in PIAAC data, this corner gives announcements and frequently asked questions among the research community. Additionally, there are links to data files, data analysis tools, such as the web portal and the International Data Explorer. So ways in which you can analyze and manipulate this sort of data without having to download advanced statistical software. You can do it right online. Additionally, you can join the Researcher Listserv, which often provides funding opportunities. We have commissioned a number of research papers and are always looking for additional partners on that. There have been some great research papers that have come out of that. Additionally, for those research papers that were already published, we have a research paper database, which is searchable, and you can look at all the previous research that has been done on PIAAC, both related to prison and the broader PIAAC assessment. There's Education and Skills Online, and this is a tool provided by the OECD, and it's basically an online version of PIAAC that for a small fee you can buy in batches and give to a population in order to assess them on the PIAAC scale, and it allows you to see where certain people are on such scale. We have outreach toolkits, which give prepackaged slides and resources, such as the ones given today, if you are interested in presenting the PIAAC data at any sort of conference or presentation that you want to give. And there are regular updates for anything PIAAC related through the PIAAC Buzz. As for past and future reports and data collections, in the past we have released the 2012 and 2014 U.S. data collection. We had the 2012 and 2014 U.S. data collection, and in spring of 2016 we released the National Center for Education Statistics, that is, released the U.S. 2012-2014 First Look report with full details on that assessment. And in the future, the National Center for Education Statistics is looking to release the U.S. Young Adults Report, which focuses on that younger adult age range, hopefully spring 2017, though that may be pushed to summer of 2017, hopefully while it's still hot outside. And then in 2017, the U.S. data collection is underway for this new version of the assessment, so it's an update to the last version, and that should be the results of that will be released in 2019. And then cycle 2 of data collection will begin in 2021 for the U.S. and more than 35 other countries. So there's a lot of PIAAC data collection coming up and a lot to be excited about. So I've been mentioning the National Center for Education Statistics, which has their website related to PIAAC here at nces.ed.gov/survey/PIAAC. And then our site for American Institutes for Research is piaacgateway.com, and that acts as a clearinghouse for anything PIAAC related. Here is the NCES website, so you can see there's fairly high level of detail regarding the PIAAC assessment, as well as all resources related to PIAAC through that site. So we highly suggest that you go and visit it. And that is it for our presentation. If you have any questions, we have our contact information up here, our email addresses, and again, please feel free to check out piaacgateway.com, where you can ask questions if you want to do so, or sign up for our researchers list. Thank you so much, and we hope you enjoyed the presentation.
Thanks so much, Derek and Emily. That was really great, and it was so rich with information. I know that I got a lot out of that, and I know I have a lot of questions of my own, so I'm excited to check out the PIAAC Gateway to get some more information and see what else I can find. And I want to thank everyone who participated on our call today. It was great to have you interacting with our speakers, with our presenters, and you asked some great questions and had some great comments. It was interesting to hear about what you're doing in your own programs. So I just want to say thank you so much. I'm going to hand it over to Jennifer for some last words.
Okay, thank you, Marcella. Thank you, Derek and Emily, for and everyone for joining us today. So we do have an evaluation, and that will pop up in on your screen after I close out the meeting. But if you need to drop off early, if you can click on the web link towards the middle of the screen and help us to improve this webinar series and all of our webinar series. And then also for a copy, a PDF copy of today's presentation, you can click on the name of the file, and that's at the bottom of your screen, and then click download file, and then you will be able to have a copy of that presentation. And if you miss it when it goes to the recording, you will also be able to do that from the recording as well. So thank you all very much for joining us today, and we will see you next time for our next webinar. Thank you.